You are listening to The Memory Keeper by Evan Vaile. Chapter 36.
When summer arrived, the season changed, but the weather didn't. The days became brighter, but not warmer. The cricket season was beginning, and several matches were scheduled to be held at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. Located to the east of the city, the MCG was capable of seating tens of thousands of spectators. The winding tracks of the local rail yard swept past the stadium, a twisting array of timber and steel. A spiderweb of black power lines festooned the sky above the tracks and powered the trains to and from the city. Claire and Reece caught a midday tram to the MCG. During the journey, Claire started to ponder the mysteries in her friend's history that he carefully avoided explaining. He had a variety of scars on his chest and back, and they didn't look like the result of medical procedures. More like the consequences of stab wounds. Even his face was marked with a couple of small scars on his jaw that were definitely not shaving cuts. As usual, there was no explanation from Reece about any of it. Claire and Reece joined the huge crowd in the MCG and found some seats at the scoreboard end. An hour into the match, they decided to go and buy some lunch. They headed down to the food shop and lined up in the shortest queue. "Did I tell you my mum's boyfriend is in Melbourne at the moment?" Claire asked. Reece shook his head. "You mean Harold?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "He's staying at the Sheraton. My mum rang me last night and asked if I would take him out to dinner. He was here a few weeks ago, but I managed to avoid seeing him. I hardly even know him. I don't know what we're going to talk about." The queue shuffled forward. Unnoticed by the young pair, a stranger in his mid-40s and casually dressed in jeans and a leather jacket was standing behind them, watching Reece with gimlet eyes. Had Reece taken a photograph of the stranger and shown it to John Q, the old man would have immediately identified the stranger as none other than Special Agent Vanna of the SPD. But as it was, Reece was unaware that, at that moment, the top dog of the Special Projects Division stood right behind him. "You don't like Harold much, do you?" Reece asked. "Not really." Claire paused. "But maybe I just need to get used to him. He only met my mum a few months ago. Apparently, the only person he knows in Melbourne is me." The queue moved forward again, and Vanna stepped to his right to get a better look at the young man in front of him. He had been responsible for the acquisition of the program's domestic subjects 2 years ago, and he remembered many of the faces. But often a man looks nothing like the boy he once was, and Vanna was far from certain that the young man before him was an escaped program inmate. Reece was nodding his head at Claire. "You want me to volunteer to come along to dinner, don't you?" he teased. "Oh, please," she begged. "I'm going to die at the restaurant with only him and me at the table. If you came along tonight, I would be so grateful. It would only be for a couple of hours." "All right," Reece said. "Okay, I'll save you from an evening with your stepfather." "He's not my stepfather," she replied quickly. Then the queue melted away and the pair stood at the counter. They selected their meat pies and soft drinks, then paid and turned to leave. No sooner had they stepped away from the line of people than the off-duty government agent in a leather jacket blocked their path. Claire and Reece paused and exchanged a glance. When the man produced a police badge, Reece's heart skipped a beat. "My name is Special Agent Vanna," he said. "I'm with the Federal Police." Then he looked to Reece. "Would you mind showing me some identification?" Reece passed his food to Claire. Sure," he said, reaching for his wallet. Reece passed Vanna his fake driver's license that John Q had arranged for him. The agent's face remained impassive as he read the name, and he murmured, "Reece Smith," as he flipped the card over to satisfy himself that the document was genuine. His eyes narrowed, and he requested anything else with a name on it. Reece handed him his university card and his ATM card. Vanna examined them and returned them to Reece. "All right," the agent said, the corners of his mouth curving into an impersonal smile. "Just a routine check. I'm sorry to have troubled you. Enjoy the day." Vanna stepped aside, and the young pair walked past. "What was that all about?" Claire asked. The expression on Reece's face was inscrutable. "Not sure," he murmured. At that moment, a shout echoed from behind Reece, the likes of which he had heard countless times in his life. When John Q had given him his new identity, he'd found it easy to remember the name Smith, but difficult to forget the name Nylander. A lifetime of habit could not be broken with merely new clothes and new cards. If his mind had been clearer and his concentration sharper, he wouldn't have fallen for the trick. But as it was, he toppled right into the government agent's little trap. "Hey, Nylander!" Vanna yelled. "Yeah?" Reece turned and yelled back. A heartbeat later, he realized his terrible mistake. "Oh shit," he mumbled. Both the agent and the inmate froze where they stood and locked eyes across the crowd. Claire glanced from one to the other, unsure of what had just transpired. Reece saw Vanna reach inside his leather jacket and withdraw a gun. Without saying a single word to Claire, he turned and ran. The crowd caught sight of the gun and screams erupted around the area. Claire was as shocked as everyone else, and she stumbled backward, dropping the food. People scrambled out of the gunman's way, and Vanna discovered he had a clear shot at the fleeing inmate. He aimed the gun at Reece's back, darting through the throng of people, and howled, "Federal police, freeze Nylander!" Reece ignored the command and waded through the massive bodies between him and escape. The next instant, he sprinted out the nearest exit. In his wake came the bray of screams and shouts as Vanna charged after him with his gun held high. Reece tore down the steps and around the side of the stadium, then weaved through the car park. Vanna's angry shouts fell behind, but the tenacious agent was still in the chase. Jollimont rail yard was fast approaching. Reece raced across a busy city street, raising irate horn blasts from the drivers, then leapt the fence and started over the gravel and the multitude of snaking tracks. His running feet stamped on steel and weeds sprouting up between the cinders. Trains thundered past him in both directions, some travelling at high speed, others creeping along at a sedate pace. Reece glanced back the way he'd come, but saw no sign of Vanna. He suspected the agent had followed him into the rail yard and was caught behind a passing train. Reece seized his opportunity to give the man the slip. A train with 6 carriages rattled past him, moving slowly enough for Reece to catch. Picking up his pace, his feet churned up the gravel beside the train as he reached for the handhold. Inches reduced to centimetres and then millimetres. A moment later, he wrapped his fingers around the steel and hauled himself up onto the moving carriage. The sliding doors on the sides of the train were locked while the vehicle was in motion, but the passageways linking the carriages were not. He groped his way into the train and shut the door against the wind. The carriage was filled with commuters, but most were busy reading or chatting. He brushed past the few who witnessed him board the vehicle in the rail yard and moved toward the head of the carriage, his gaze directed out the large windows on the side of the train which faced the MCG. The afternoon sun gleamed opaquely off the glass, and he couldn't discern what had become of his pursuer. When he came to the end of the carriage, he opened the door and stepped across the juncture, staring down at the thundering steel wheels. There were fewer people in the next carriage, and he progressed quickly to its end, striving to put as much distance between himself and Vanna as possible. He wasn't sure if the agent had boarded the train, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. Vanna skidded to a halt in the centre of the rail yard and desperately cast his gaze around for his quarry. He was exhausted from the chase. Perspiration streamed down his forehead, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. The clamour of passing trains subsided, and in the brief lull he realised that Nylander was nowhere to be seen. He swore in frustration and kicked at the stony ground. Then his eyes settled on the silver rear of a carriage trundling along in the distance. The other trains had been moving too quickly for Nylander to board, but that one was travelling slowly enough. Holstering his weapon inside his jacket, Vanna sucked in air and sprinted after the carriage. He correctly guessed it to be 30 metres away, but he cut that distance with every passing step. Another train bore down on him, and he leapt off its tracks. It roared past, missing him by inches. He switched to the tracks of the carriage in his sights and summoned up the last of his energy. His stride lengthened, and his final sprint carried him past the tail of the train to a handrail at the juncture separating the rear carriage and the next. As he lifted himself off the gravel, his legs kept running in the air until he planted his feet on the mechanical link. He stood in the narrow space between the two shifting carriages and felt the tug of the vehicle as it began to accelerate. He pushed the heavy steel door open and stepped into the train. The zipper on his leather jacket had loosened during his sprint, revealing his holstered weapon. When the seated commuters spied the handgun, a wave of panicked screams erupted from the crowd. The people nearest the government agent scurried away. Vanna withdrew his federal police identification and flashed it around. "I'm a police officer," he gasped. Did anyone see a young man wearing jeans and a shirt jump on board this train from the rail yard? An elderly lady, clutching a glossy plastic bag from one of the city boutique stores, hazarded a reply. He came in that door and hurried into the next carriage, she said timidly. Is he one of the bad guys? Yes, ma'am, he is, Vanna replied, starting through the train. The alarmed crowd gave him clear passage through the carriage. A few moments later, he crossed the mechanical juncture and stepped through the next steel door. He zipped up his jacket to conceal his handgun, but kept his police identification handy to rouse the commuters. He moved from carriage to carriage, following a trail of nods and startled replies, knowing that he would trap the ex-program inmate in the lead carriage. The train was travelling too fast for the young man to jump, and there was nowhere else for him to go. Meanwhile, Reece had already spied the agent wading through the rear carriages, and he also understood his predicament. When he arrived at the lead carriage, he stared out the window at the uneven ground racing past at tremendous speed, and knew that jumping to freedom was out of the question. The threadbare carpet thrummed beneath his feet, and he glanced down, considering his options. He saw a trapdoor in the floor, but didn't fancy his chances of remaining hidden for very long. The underside of the vehicle was certainly a death trap of thundering steel wheels on rails with no place to crawl around. And he counted over a dozen commuters in the carriage, and that meant a dozen witnesses to divulge his hidey hole to the government agent. Reece turned his eyes to the ceiling and knew it was his only option. Vanna was one carriage behind, and armed with a gun. Within the close confines of the train, Reece was defenseless. He exited the rail car, then stood on the mechanical juncture, staring through the window at Vanna, querying the commuters in the carriage behind. The wind circulating through the narrow lee between the vehicles gave Reece a hint of the tempest above. Before the government agent glanced forward, Reece hauled himself out of sight and onto the top of the train. The gale howled in his ears and tore at his limbs. His feet struggled for traction on the slippery surface, and he moved with wary steps, hunched over like a surfer riding a long board on an enormous wave. Suspended at shoulder height above the train was a black power cable carrying enough voltage to melt him to the roof. He was careful not to touch it. On every second carriage, a metal arm with a claw at the end, a device which engineers called a pantograph, tickled the cable to deliver electricity to the rumbling wheels far below. The power cable and pantographs were live and touching, either meant electrocution. Reece worked his way toward the rear of the vehicle, away from Vanna, knowing that such a plan would buy him minutes only, and that if the train didn't stop soon, he would be forced to face the agent. His white shirt lashed against his body like a chained ghost. He felt every bump and turn in the winding tracks as the train tore through the outer limits of the city. With each furtive leap across the yawning divide separating the carriages, the wind gripped him as if never to let go, but he always fell back to the train top with a thud. On several occasions, he ducked below the height of the black power cable to avoid being decapitated by low iron beams that flew by. Inside the lead carriage, Vanna searched the faces of the commuters, but none was his target. When he produced his federal police identification and started asking questions, he started receiving answers he didn't want to hear. A young man got onto the roof of the train just a minute ago, one passenger said. He climbed straight up with barely a backward glance, another added. Moments later, Vanna braced himself on the mechanical juncture between the two carriages, listening to the grinding steel wheels below and watching the city hurtle by on either side. A thin strip of cloudy Melbourne sky greeted his raised eyes, and then he clambered up and peeped along the length of the train. The wind tore at his hair and filled his ears with a terrific shriek. He squinted in the brightness and spotted Nylander scampering from carriage to carriage in the distance. Vanna crawled out onto the silver top with less certainty than the younger man had moments ago. Nevertheless, he was a highly trained field operative accustomed to life-threatening danger, and it was his sang-froid in hostile environments that separated him from the mere pretenders. He stared at the high-voltage black power cable and pantographs and knew his life would flash before his eyes if he so much as touched either with one finger. Drawing his gun, he cautiously proceeded down the train, leaping from carriage to carriage, closing the gap between himself and Nylander. By the time Reece glanced back, Vanna was on the rail car immediately behind. The agent vaulted the deep crevice between the carriages and came to a standstill. He raised his gun and pointed it at the crafty ex-program subject. The pair faced each other, only meters apart now. A steel pantograph clawed at the air behind Reece. The young man paused and held his hands away from his body in capitulation. Vanna nodded and smiled. He faced the inmate, and beyond, the rear of the train. "You are Nylander, aren't you?" he yelled over the shriek of the wind. Reece glanced past the federal agent, at the footbridge in the distance which overarched the tracks. "I don't know what you're talking about," he answered. "My name is Smith." The government agent grinned. The barrel of his gun never wavered from the young man's chest. "Come on, Nylander," he yelled. "That ploy worked when you were holding a fake driver's license, but not now. I remember you, from when you were in the youth detention center with Ratboy. But you clearly don't remember me." "Don't worry," Reece growled. "It's all coming back to me in a rush." Vanna chuckled. Despite Nylander's most wanted status on the SPD lists, the agent couldn't help but like the kid. "I'll bet it is," he grunted. "I'm not like the others, Vanna," Reece called out over the howl of the wind. "You're wasting your time putting me in jail." "I don't get to make that decision, Nylander," Vanna replied. "I just do what they tell me to do. Now, I want you to climb off the roof, nice and easy." He waved his gun in the direction of the gap between the carriages. Behind Vanna, the footbridge had swelled in size and was only moments away. Its dark shadow scrolled along the contours of the silver train like a garrote wire. A rectangular steel sign hung from the concrete bulk just above the black power cable, warning pedestrians not to lean over the railing. The sign sped toward the train, and Reece watched the message. "Touching this wire will cause immediate death race straight at Vanna's skull at 70 kilometers per hour. "One thing first, Vanna," Reece yelled. "And what's that?" the agent yelled. "If I were you, I'd duck," Reece exclaimed. "Nylander," the agent hollered, shaking his head. "Do you really think I'm stupid enough to fall for that trick? I expected more from—" Suddenly, in the corner of his eye, Vanna caught sight of the edge of something large and concrete on the far side of the tracks, shaped like a footbridge. Some dormant corner of the agent's brain made the life-saving calculation. If there was one footbridge end, there was certainly another, and the pair were probably joined in the middle. Over the tracks, the train was about to speed beneath a solid concrete arch. "Holy shit!" Vanna screamed, and ducked just in time. The rusty sign bolted to the bridge scraped his head, drawing blood as it tore past. He stumbled, clutching his cut ear. Reece crouched down as the archway shot over his head, then launched himself at the startled agent. The pair tumbled to the rooftop, and the gun slipped from Vanna's grasp. It clattered onto the steel surface and slid toward the edge, but didn't fall off. Vanna scowled and cracked Reece across the face with a vicious backhander, and then lunged for his weapon. The ex-program inmate tripped the agent up, then rolled him over and bruised him with a battery of punches. His fists worked like pistons to flatten Vanna's nose. The agent's desperate hands clawed at Nylander's face, searching for his eyes. The train was racing along beside a city street. Drivers stared out of their windscreens at the men atop the speeding train and honked their horns. On the train, the combatants stood, gasping in air, eyeing one another warily. A trail of blood trickled down Vanna's neck where his ear had been clipped by the steel sign. Reece spat blood from his cut lip. He positioned himself between the agent and the gun, which lay on the roof some meters away, and waited for an opportunity to kick the weapon off the train. "Why did you do it, Vanna?" Reece yelled. "Why did you put all those kids in the program?" Vanna took his bulky leather jacket off and threw it away. It flapped in the tumultuous air before fading in the distance. "Because it was my job," he replied. Reece shot him an accusing stare. "You don't even know what the program was about, do you?" he yelled. "I know enough," Vanna snapped. "The program started with over 200 subjects and ended with half that number," Reece continued. "You sent 100 people underground to die. You may as well have dug their graves yourself." "Bullshit, Nylander," Vanna spat. "They chose to try and escape, and they died in the attempt. You can't blame me for that." "What?" Reece hollered. "You think the 100 inmates who never emerged from the program died during the escape?" Vanna wiped his hand along the blood on his mouth. "The government told me they were killed in the explosion," he stated. No, Vanna, Reece replied, slowly shaking his head. The other half died long before the escape. The only thing the explosion incinerated was the evidence. The agent pointed an angry finger at Reece. That's not true, he growled. If you don't trust me, then find out for yourself, Reece yelled. Or are you scared of what you'll discover? Vanna's face twisted into an angry grimace, and he lunged at Reece. The pair traded blows like professional boxers in the ring, and the agent began to realize just how good the young man was. Reece was fit and lightning fast, and despite Vanna's years of training, he could find no hole in the young man's defenses. Vanna kept swinging his fists, but Reece matched him at every quarter, wearing the older man down in a masterful display of hand-to-hand combat skills. Vanna felt his own energy reserves dwindling. In desperation, he stepped closer and attempted to trip his opponent, but Reece outmaneuvered him. He span around, wrapped his arm around the agent's neck, and kneed him in the jaw. Scientists say time slows down at high speeds, but of course they mean at the speed of light. Even so, traveling atop the train at a mere 70 kilometers per hour, Vanna suddenly felt reality elongate like an elastic band. He toppled backward from Nylander's knee, arms flapping like a flightless bird. Once, twice, toward the electrified pantograph in the center of the railcar's roof. His feet remained planted on the deck, while his body pivoted over his ankles like the single stroke of a metronome, counting the seconds to his death. He was falling toward the pantograph on a one-way trip to electrocution. Reece saw the danger and acted. He threw himself across the carriage roof, sliding on his stomach toward the gun resting near the precipitous edge. Just as his fingers wrapped around the weapon's black grip, he heard Vanna slam into the pantograph and cry out in pain. The agent's body convulsed like a prisoner frying in the electric chair. Without looking at the dying man, Reece rolled over and aimed the gun at the black power cable suspended just above the roof of the train, and fired. The report of the shot silenced even the howl of the wind. The cable snapped, cutting power to the whole train, including the lethal pantograph against which Vanna had collapsed. The two loose ends of the cable recoiled in opposite directions, snaking through the air with a crackle of blue electricity before falling to the stony ground beside the train. Vanna pushed himself off the pantograph and crawled along the roof, coughing violently. A trail of smoke rose from his hair as though the grays of his scalp were evaporating onto the wind. He sucked in breath, then sat back woodenly. He almost appeared to be in some kind of yoga position. He squinted at the young man through strained eyes. With the power cut, the vehicle began to grind to a halt. Reece looked at the gun in his hands, then threw it over the edge. He sat down beside the fallen agent, and neither uttered a word for a long moment. "I could have shot you, Vanna," Reece said finally. "Or I could have let you fry. Instead, I saved your life. I've never killed anyone, and I'm not about to start with you." He paused and regarded the agent. Small bubbles had appeared in the blood caked on Vanna's neck. His hair was no longer on fire, and he seemed to be breathing okay. "But the others from the program are killers. I can help you catch them, if you'll let me." Reece waited to see if the agent would say anything, but he didn't seem to be in a talking mood. Moments later, the train shuddered to a stop. He climbed down from the roof and stared up at the shocked agent, who hadn't moved from his seated position. "The government has been lying to you all along, Vanna," Reece yelled. "Just think about it." Commuters aboard the train stared out the windows at the young man, never knowing who he was. Reece vaulted the fence beside the tracks, then ran off down the street.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.